Still life more as a kind of grander concentration rather than the exercise-based focus that we talked about last time. And I think I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the Greek myth of Zeuxis. And basically, this is a recorded myth that was recorded by Pliny the Elder in a book of history. Now, we kind of have to take that with a grain of salt, right? So this was a staged contest between Pariasis and Zeuxis. When Zeuxis unveiled his painting of just simple grapes, they appeared so luscious, they invited the birds to fly down and peck at them. Zeuxis then asked Pariasis to pull aside the curtain from his painting, only for Pariasis to reveal the curtain itself was the painting. And Zeuxis was forced to concede defeat. Zeuxis is rumored to have said, "I have deceived the birds, but Pariasis has deceived Zeuxis." Why this is called the myth of Zeuxis is beyond me, but if we kind of unpack this, it's a myth about the guy who lost, right? The guy who lost interest in seeing what is behind this curtain. So the psychoanalyst and theorist Jacques Lacan, so if you take a psychology class, you'll learn about him. In 1964, he observed that the myth of Zeuxis reveals an interesting aspect of human cognition. While animals are attracted to superficial appearances, like the birds flying down to peck the grapes, humans are enticed by the idea of that which is hidden, which I think yields an interesting beginning to talk about at least the content of still life. I don't know if anybody has ever actually talked to you about the content of still life. There is wonderful emblems, symbols, portents, all sorts of things relating to the function of the still life beyond just the painting of objects. It is a genre. Genre actually means the everyday. But when we apply it to art, it means sort of the subject matters, right? The still life genre, the landscape genre, the portrait genre, the history painting genre. But a still life in plural is still lifes, not lives. It's generally just depicting something that is inanimate, usually commonplace objects found around the household, typically. They are typically in orientation about the banal and the domestic. It can also be sort of reinvented and relensed today, and I'll show you a few artists who do that towards the end. And then here we have an early Pompeian fresco, so it's painted directly onto the plaster in the upper left-hand corner there, of a still life in, of course, a Roman wall, around the time of Christ. And you know that Pompeii had the big old explosion from the volcano, and it pretty much covered everything in ash and preserved the city pretty close to what it was when people were walking around. And then the lower left-hand corner is simply an illustrative painting showing the birds going in, trying to get some of those grapes, and Zeuxis watching. I'll start, though, with a focus on the 17th century Dutch still life. And it kind of circles around my absolute favorite type of genre painting within the still life, sort of a subgenre of the vanitas. And this is a Peter Claus. So the Dutch were, you have to kind of contextualize historically what was going on in the Netherlands at this time. And the Netherlands opened up their borders internationally. They were a trading port that was really sort of the beacon of all of Europe in the trading, buying, and selling of goods. And they were one of the only countries that actually traded with Asia, fully traded with Asia, including Japan. And Japan, as you know, hopefully, maybe you don't, had closed its borders completely after about 1500, when they really didn't like Christian missionaries coming over trying to convert their people to Christianity. And so they literally shut their borders down and didn't trade with anybody, except for the other Japanese and other Asians. So the vanitas is generally a depiction of these objects that are international, right? They're not just the things that are found around the house. They are the things that are evocative of wealth. But the Vanitas itself was emblematic of the futility of life. If you were a deeply Christian person in the 17th century, either a Catholic or the beginnings of Protestant, what we have is the notion that your life on earth is nothing when the infinite is ultimately your connection with the universe and God, right? Your physical matter doesn't matter, right? The matters don't matter. So as we look at these paintings, vanitas means what it sounds like, vanity. All is vanity. And there's a line in the Bible that I have not memorized, but maybe one of you has. Oh, wait. No. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity, something like that. So the word in Latin means emptiness. Generally, it means that there is meaninglessness of earthly life and the transient nature of vanity. That vanity doesn't last, right? Paintings are executed in the Vanitas style. They're meant to be a reminder of the transience of life, so how quickly life goes, and how quickly it can be snuffed out. The futility of pleasure, so everything relating to bodily pleasures, so music, art, sexuality, food, theater, right? All the things that are about our pleasure in life. And then, of course, the certainty of death. They also provided a moral justification for many paintings of attractive objects. This is around the time of the Reformation and the iconoclast movement. And the iconoclast movement was a whole movement of sort of zealoty Catholics who would go around smashing objects of art throughout Europe because they thought that they were totems. They were thought that they were golden calves, right? Thou shalt not make any graven objects, right? So this is sort of an explanation, an entree into notions about Catholicism or Christianity and one's demise through the crafting of beautiful objects in and of themselves. So common Vanitas symbols include skulls. Generally, there's almost always some sort of reference to a skull. That is obviously a reminder of the certainty of death. There's generally either rotten fruit or fruit that's right about to turn. And how do you know it's right about to turn? It might have a little black spot on it, like a banana might have a little black spot on it, but you won't see one in the 17th century Dutch still life. But you also might see little flies, like a fly, painted very, very particularly on the surface of one of those fruits. That obviously symbolizes decay, like aging. You'll see bubbles sometimes. They symbolize the brevity of life and suddenness of death. They're not like a happy subject at all. Smoke, which is sort of the prayers of the people, but also it is transient. Once it's here, it's gone as quickly as it came. Watches, symbolizing time. Hourglasses, same. The musical instruments, which symbolize the ephemeral nature of life. So like that pleasure can be of the spirit and mind beyond just the body. Fruit, flowers, and butterflies can be interpreted in the same way. However, early Vanitas images that were more predominantly Catholic that depict, say, a butterfly actually are referencing the Virgin Mary or the transformation of God from man to resurrected Son of Man, right? You might see something like lemon, lots of lemon, peeled lemon. It's beautiful to look at. It seems like it's going to be sweet. However, it's very, very sour, right? The sort of dichotomy there of life and death. And then seafood, attractive to look at, bitter to taste. And this all relates to another subgenre of painting called the trompe-l'oeil. This is a term you should memorize. It's kind of common knowledge. It's French for deceive the eye. Literally translates to deceive the eye. And that's how you say it. Say it with me. Trompe-l'oeil. Trompe-l'oeil. A lot of people will put the L on the end there. Don't put the L on the end. Basically, it's a technique that uses incredibly realistic imagery, or I'll say naturalistic imagery, in order to create a kind of optical illusion. Yes, question?
Wasn't the orange peels, like in these old style paintings, like a flex of some kind of older painting?
They are a flex in the manner that they are kind of showcasing their wealth. because citrus obviously doesn't grow in Northern Europe at all whatsoever, so it has to be imported. So it will kind of, I suppose, flex one's wealth. Yes?
But like I meant like when they do the peels off the fruit, like I read somewhere like the artisans who could do that was also showing off their skill.
Oh, yeah. Well, just wait till I show you here what kind of skill we're talking about. The Dutch were really about the trompe l'oeil. And this is a painting of the back of a painting. So the toying with reality, but also the meditation and metaphor of the painting itself. The painting is just a bunch of mud on a canvas or a panel. And in that exercise, man is sort of acting as God. He is creating a natural world like a mini demigod. And in that, it plays with this sort of, the Vanitas plays with the notion of there's no way you can possibly be God, no matter how hard you try. It's still just paint on a canvas. No matter how marvelous it is, it cannot marvel in comparison to the great creator, right? No matter what your beliefs, that's what these beliefs are really kind of invoking here. And really the Dutch were, I think, the best at painting still life. This is really this sort of high arc of naturalist painting. In the Louvre, there is several rooms that you can walk through that just have these paintings of Hunt and flowers that will knock your socks off. And this relates to the allegory. And the allegory might contextually kind of give you some meaning as you look at these images of painted objects, because the viewer at the time would have understood what these objects represented beyond just, it is a painting of a bunch of animals that have been killed and drug home from the hunt. So an allegory is a representation of an abstract or spiritual meaning through concrete or material forms. It's a figurative treatment of one subject under the guise of another. So it is essentially a painting with symbolic narrative. Although symbol is different than emblem, is different than metaphor, right? And if you're familiar with all of these literature, terminology, they are different things. So as you sort of investigate this, if this is something of interest to you, you want to start using the appropriate terms. But these images of the hunt are essentially vanitas, even though there's no skull, right? We have recently field-dressed animals that have been drug home from the fields in a conversation about bounty, right? This is an abundance. This is God's blessing, but it's also a picture of carcasses, splayed out, open, vulnerable, lifeless. So it is about the futility of life as well. Peter Klaus, I think you're thinking about him when we're thinking about peeled lemons there, is sort of the heavy hitter here. We've got a knocked over glass, which is not how we leave our table typically, right? This is a breakfast image. So the knocked over glass is also about the quick snuffing out of life. We have, of course, the bread there, which is about abundance, and then those are little oysters. Yet again, another vanitas. Along the same lines, we have Dehim, who is sort of the pillar of botanical painters. These are fantastic and truly beautiful, of the same sorts of subject. And you see the fruits that are really, really, really ripe, right? And flowers, of course, that are, if you know anything about the history of the Netherlands, they cultivated tulips. And they got kind of crazy about the tulip because they were such a rich nation during the 17th century. They started to hybridize them. They became kind of known for the tulip, even though they're not actually in origin from there. So it was really a mark of wealth as well to have cut flowers, because it means you're using your fields to grow something else other than food. Here's a detail of a Dehim. Take your breath away. And you see a lot of the fruits have been so ripened that they split in half open. You see that lower left-hand corner there? And then you also see, what's that vessel in the center? Where do you think it's from? You betcha. So we have trade with the East. So we have all these things being evidenced in a still life which tell us a little bit about the values of the culture. And the thing is that even if you were fairly lower middle class, kind of poor, you would have had, maybe not a painting of this sort of refinement, but you would have had oil paintings in your home if you were living in the Netherlands at this time. Because they were really meditations on the abundance of life, but the fact that it is compelling you to be grateful. Because faith, according to the Christian, sort of doctrine, is an understanding that your life is a gift. And if your gift has been given to you, it implies a creator. Chardin painted in a little bit of a different way. He was also a Dutch still life painter. He painted with a sort of peasant lens. They're very brown. They seem kind of dreary, but they're much more pensive, and they're much more of a celebration of the simple rather than the extravagance of the other painters that I've shown you. Here's another Chardin. And this, of course, is, the painter's table. We've got the palette and the brushes, and we have a little plaster cast that he might work from, some value scales underneath that plaster cast, right? A decanter for oil, some books filled with etchings probably, and then a little award that he got for being a great painter. Down south, we've got Spain, and we've got Francisco Zurbarán, who is intensely a Catholic painter. You might have seen one or two of his paintings of monks. They're very dark. They have very black backgrounds. But he was also a still life painter. And his still lifes aren't any less meaningful than the other paintings. These are paintings of lemons, which we already talked a little bit about the meaning of. However, sometimes we have what's called a visual pun. A visual pun. A visual pun. Start looking for these artists, because what is the visual pun here? Breasts and bellies, pregnant bellies. Specifically, the belly of the Virgin. So these visual puns would have actually communicated these things. It would have been part of the sort of consciousness of the culture in which they were made. And then, of course, the rose over to the right next to the teacup, which is a reference to the Virgin Mary. Directly symbolic of the Virgin Mary. The Spanish were really great at painting some still life. Here is Luis Mendez of course, ripe melons in the field. We have integrating the landscape into that. And then we fast forward into the 19th century, and we have Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Here we have Paul Cézanne. We talked a little bit about Paul Cézanne sort of becoming, the father of modernism by breaking the conventions of description. And what he's doing, of course, is fracturing a space in order to sacrifice likeness to uphold the greater design. You see how wonky that table is, how it looks like everything's going to fall right off? It's not because he couldn't draw. It's because he was making very, very distinctive decisions to manipulate what he was seeing to create a better picture rather than a more realistic picture. So he kind of liberated artists from being slaves to vision. And then, of course, we talked at length about Manet, and I really think this is just, they take my breath away at how humble and lovely they are, done towards the end of his life. And then we fast forward even more, go another 100 years into the future. We have sort of the 90s here, from the 50s, 60s, all the way to the 90s. We have Ewan Uglow, who is a British painter, primarily of the figure, but also extensively of the still life. He was fixated, obsessed, you could say, with sighting and measuring. You all remember sighting and measuring, right? Lord love a duck. Sighting and measuring. You'll see all these little tick marks in his paintings. That's because he painted them over such a long period of time, the fruit would rot. And so he would have to paint the change of the sighting and measuring. So it was very much about planes and observation, but not necessarily about the beauty of paint, but more the beauty of the design of the paint, the sort of richness of color and change in description. Giorgio Morandi painted around the same period of time. He didn't die in the 90s, though he died earlier. But he was a professor. He's very well known in the still life world. In fact, most major collections have a piece of his. So it might be something you walk by while at a museum and not notice. But if I give you some context into what he was doing, he painted pretty much from the same 25 objects his entire life. And he was a painting professor in Italy. And what his paintings are evocative of are social groupings. So the longer you look at Giorgio Morandi's paintings, they sort of look chalky, they sort of look a little wobbly, a little wonky, right? They're intentionally so. The guy could draw too. If you do this for 40 years, you know you can draw a straight line. But he's sort of playing off of what Cezanne did, except his paintings, I think, really do touch on the way we socialize by performing these little weird moments where the objects sort of kiss, touch, hug, congregate, chatter. And that moves us into abstraction. I've got here 2 Richard Diebenkorn paintings, which I didn't label, sorry. I did, right there at the bottom. And I've got a quote from him. And he was a painter in the 50s and 60s on the West Coast in the California area. And in the 50s and 60s, I'm going to remind you that Jackson Pollock was like the rage of the town, of the art world. So we have these people who are actually painting representationally, actual objects and people and things, over on the West Coast, but painting them in a way that Jackson Pollock might have painted it. Really loose, really expressive. So he says abstract literally means to draw from or separate. In this sense, every artist is abstract. A realistic or non-objective approach makes no difference. It's the result that counts. And what does that mean? Well, abstract always works on a scale, right? You are inherently creating abstraction by just simply making a picture of a thing out of mud, because it isn't a real thing, right? So how far you actually depart from that is what the conversation he's touching on. In the same area and around the same time, we have these sort of, they're called Bay Area figurative painters. And when I say figurative, I don't necessarily mean exclusively focusing on the figure. Figurative just means representational as well. We have James Weeks painting, elements of his studio, the still life, people. We have Wayne Thiebaud. A lot of graphic designers just adore him. He painted a lot of, delectable things that you might find at a bakery, but he painted everything in this manner, a manner that sort of looks like he's painting frosting, right? So there's a visual pun there of actually transforming the paint into the thing itself. I grew up in the Chicagoland area, and I grew up near the Art Institute of Chicago. And so I grew up looking at this painting, James Valerio. And James Valerio teaches at Northwestern University and is considered to be one of the most highly regarded figurative artists working today. And this painting is like, no kidding, 20 foot by 20 foot. Is that big, of a lady sleeping in front of a still life. And of course, he's talking about art history here. And you can't really call him a photorealist because there's something not so photographic about what he does, although it's influenced by the photograph, especially the way in which it's cropped and the way in which it's lit and the edges. But James Valerio works from direct observation, literally sitting himself up in front of this still life or subject. An artist who straddles the line between abstraction and representation working today is Sangram Majumdar. I like his work a lot. I think he really attacks his paintings. I think he's clever in how he chooses his subject and how he renegotiates what is important enough to look at. Because, I want to remind you, you on average see 10,000 images a day. A day. And so you're so saturated in images, that should make you really kind of take pause when you're standing in front of something that is essentially about a record of time and looking, paintings. And as you make these works, you will see that they are millimeters and millimeters of reflection of hours. And that is an important and in many ways counterculture to the heavily image-saturated world that we currently live in, which is about selling you crap, right? And what he's doing is he's looking at that crap in a very different way. He's honoring it. Susan Jane Walt makes these tiny little paintings. They're like 10 inches by 10 inches. They're small. And they sell for like 10 grand a pop. No kidding. She's got a New York gallery, and I've seen it, every single one of them sold out in a tiny little room with about 20 of them in there. No kidding. When you think you can't make a living in painting, it's not necessarily true. Sometimes it's about commitment. Live your dreams, y'all. And she really does, I think, continue on the work of Cezanne. They're very simple, humble setups. They're very centrally located, And they just have slight differences in the arrangement every time. Although she is sort of, she's not about being a marvelous painter. She's about being a really contemplative painter. Antonio Lopez Garcia is still living and working today. He's considered to be a Spanish living treasure. Yes, they still have those. They have those in Japan too, and where they celebrate a person like a celebrity because of their artistic contribution or creative contribution. And this is one of his still lifes. If you've ever been over to Europe, yes, they eat rabbit. Rabbit's a thing. It's just like chicken, except it's, I think it's white meat. Isn't it white meat? Red meat? It's been a long time since I've eaten. What, is it white meat?
I think so.
I can't remember. Anyway, rabbit. This is a bit carnal, right? And it does definitely remark on the Vanitas for sure. He paints very, very sterile subject matter that are very, very evocative of the southern Spanish light. And yes, Where You Live does actually touch on difference of light. If you live in LA, it's a very different atmospheric perspective than if you live here, where it feels like the swamp in August, right? You can see the moisture just sitting on everything. And he really does touch on this sort of scrubbed clean, walked out of fascism in 1989. I think, Franco died in 1989 or 90. There's a sort of poverty to his work that I think is very beautiful and also very quiet. He does them all from direct observation. Ellen Altfest is a little older than me. She's about 45 years old. She makes very small paintings that take her about a year to make. They are intensely observed. They are intensely about surface. And I think what she's doing is she's actually thinking about abstraction as a means of the evolution of looking, right? We see abstraction when we look at something for a long, 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 long period of time. And she objectifies everything she looks at, including this man. He doesn't have a name. He doesn't have a face. He just has a little hiney on top of a paint-smeared stool, right? It is about the hair. It is about the tan line. It is about the intense record of looking, which is what we do as visual artists. We train people how to see. Here's another of firewood on her studio floor. And you begin to see what I'm saying about abstraction, right? A little different, touching on the exercises that we would normally do in a painting one class, except they're enormous. This Victor Pesce painting over to the left, I've seen it. It's about 5 foot. It's huge. So when you see something like that, it's very grandiose and very much about flirting with the notion of the abstraction that came out of the 60s, hard-edged geometric abstraction. Here's another of Victor Pesce's work. And then someone who's very influenced by Ewan Uglow is Andy Pankhurst. He's working today. More of his work. Someone that we brought in a couple years back, she's a still life artist, and she's done a whole sort of array of paintings that dealt with her life as a mother and the difficulty of being a painter, trying to be a serious professional painter while bringing up children. So they're very much about the refuse and mess of the everyday as these children are being reared. So you'll see children's drawings, like laundry being folded, that kind of thing. But I want you to notice how little white there is in her image, especially in that upper left-hand corner. Gray on gray on gray on gray. And so the light is very much not lit by an electric light, it's lit by the natural light. Catherine Kehoe makes tiny paintings. They're very hard-edged. You might like her. There's another Erin Radicke, sorry, that's out of order. The woman who, this is a party, for a small child. Up in Indiana, you have a powerhouse of a couple, married couple, Tim Kennedy and Eve Mansdorf. They run a lot of the painting program at Indiana. And they are observational still life painters, as well as landscape and portraits. And I've included some of their work here. We've got a watercolor over to the right. Tim Kennedy, that's her husband. Victor Rica, talked about him. He does all of his paintings in one sitting. Catherine Murphy, I think, is also doing what Ellen Altfest is doing here with the cleavage painting. It very much is a commentary about the still life that is, of course, the counter to the bodily, which is faith and the body and the despicable body, right? And then, of course, just a real simple magnets on her, magnets on her refrigerator. And these are pretty darn large. They take a long period to do. In fact, I've heard a story where she did a painting of her husband's beard clippings in the water of the bathroom that she loved so much, it took her so long, that they built another bathroom so that she wouldn't have to use the bathroom so she could paint it. Like, that's commitment, yo. She used to be the chair of painting at Yale. And then we have a photorealist, Audrey Flack. If you know anything about the photorealist movement, it really actually came about in the 70s. And most of photorealists didn't actually work from prints. They worked with a slide being projected directly against a large canvas. And photorealists typically would paint very large scale. Audrey Flack was really interested in the Vanitas, and you see the rose behind her, you see her standing there. They're painted large so that you begin to see the difference between sight and the monocular form of vision that is the photograph. Because the photograph is not realistic. The photograph is mechanical. You don't see like a photograph. You turn things because you have two eyes. Your depth of vision doesn't work the way a lens does. You don't see edges in the way a camera does. So when people say that, it's just because they've been conditioned to believe that that's the way we see, because we grow up in front of a television set now. But really, that's what the photorealist's intention was to point at the distortion of the photograph. And another photorealist is Neil Gall. He sits at a table with his very small child, and he makes these ugly, ugly sculptures out of trash. And then he photographs them and paints them in hyper-realistic detail. And so you see things like gum or hot glue. He'll also like carve into the photograph or collage into it and then paint from that. So it begins to talk about abstraction beyond just the unadulterated, direct sculpture that he's working from. Nancy Switzer you'll like to look at when you get to your palette knife paintings. And she makes pretty much only palette knife paintings of primarily reflective objects. And these reflective objects are painted wet and wet, right? So cans and sardines. I think I might have another one, yeah. And how she does these is she obviously loads on the paint, mixes them, applies it with the palette knife. And then she takes both the palette at the end of the day and the painting and throws it in a freezer. Because oil paint, if it's frozen, will never skin over. And so she'll bring it out the next day, and what happens on the surface of the panel or the canvas is that she can move it around and sculpt into it. So she works at a scale that enables her to be able to do that. I love her paintings. Josephine Halverson, I talked a little bit about her. She paints all of her stuff in one sitting. Remember, I told you she throws out almost over half of them. Drives a little truck. This is her. This is me as an undergrad. I was a still life painter. Up until about junior year when I was like, okay, I want to paint bodies. And I inevitably became a figurative painter. But I took it very seriously. I did direct observation painting. I set up crap in my mom's basement, lit it, and painted it, and made these large paintings that were actually kind of modeled after another painter named Janet Fish, who I idolized. And then I talked to you about the paintings a day. Here's some more examples of those. Grisaille. More grisaille. So, as you can see, still life has a multitude of expressions. How you choose to paint it, how you choose to move the paint around, how you choose to transcribe what it is that you see is the thing that strips away the complicated nature of the question of meaning. And the thing is if you sit up a still life, yeah, you can probably divorce yourself from meaning, but the reality is, whatever it is that you choose to represent always communicates something. So if anything I want you to walk away from this lecture is very much that intrinsically, the choices you make as a painter, how you paint something, the colors you choose to use, the design you choose to impose, the subject matter that you draw from, does engage your viewer in a conversation. And that is up to you to figure out what that is.